The Gospel according to Mark. On that day, when evening had come, Jesus said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with them. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But Jesus was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. Jesus said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. You may be seated. Well, I can tell it's becoming summer. It's been pretty warm this last week. On hot days in the summer months, I wait as long as I can to go on evening walks with our dog, Emily. But we usually go down and walk along the Willamette, both of us, the dog and I, sweating a little bit more with every step. And I look out, and I wish that I was on the river, floating along in its cool waters as the sun meanders its way down in the sky. It sounds pretty peaceful, doesn't it? In our gospel for today, Jesus and the disciples were out on a body of water, but it was anything but a peaceful experience. So to give us some context, they're out on the Sea of Galilee, and we should know that the Sea of Galilee was well known for its storms. As scholar William Barclay explains, storms often came literally out of the blue, with shattering and terrifying suddenness, surprising those who ventured onto the sea. But even though this was a relatively common experience, the great storm described in our gospel for today must have been particularly severe. What do we know about many of the disciples? They were fishermen. So they would have been out on the Sea of Galilee in a storm before. But even they were terrified. One of the most severe storms I've ever been in was in Tijuana, Mexico, on a mission trip. Several churches from McMinnville, where I'm from, that's where I went to high school, had teamed up to send youth down to Tijuana to build houses during spring break. On our fourth day there, we were supposed to stay for 5, but on the fourth day, the skies began to darken. There was that kind of ominous feeling you get when you realize that something bad is about to happen with the weather. But we had teams of willing workers, so we sent them out to try to finish their projects. I stayed behind at the camp to try to protect our site if a storm blew through. And did a storm ever blow through? Our tents were saved, but only because we took out all of the poles and just prayed that the weight of the stuff inside would keep them from blowing away. We had taken all of our stuff down to Tijuana in a big 20-foot long Penske truck. And I remember standing on the ramp of the truck with several others. We could lean forward into the wind without holding ourselves back at all, without falling. We laughed in the teeth of the storm. But I guarantee you, we would not have laughed in the teeth of that storm if we had been in it on a boat. And here's a crazy thought. Jesus slept. He slept through a storm like that on a small wooden fishing boat. I know he is Jesus, but still, he didn't wake up. until the boat began to sink and the disciples finally, shook him awake. How could Jesus sleep when our lives are in danger? They must have been thinking. The disciples asked Jesus, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Perhaps even more terrifying than the storm itself was the possibility that Jesus, their beloved teacher and the very Son of God, did not care about what was happening to them. Often we are too quick to allegorize Bible readings. That means to interpret them as saying something directly to our current day situations. But in this case, this text begs to be allegorized. We do not need to be in a boat in the midst of a massive storm to experience the terrifying storms of life, to experience a deep longing for God to care about what we are going through. One terrifying storm of life that I've witnessed more frequently than I would like a lot lately in my work at the hospital is being with people as they are diagnosed with terminal illnesses. I feel like my future is being stolen from me, one of my patients said to me a few months ago. It would not be surprising for someone in that situation to ask, "God, do you not care that I am perishing?" A terminal illness can also be devastating, of course, for those who love the dying person. They too might ask, "God, do you not care that my loved one is perishing?" But it's not just death or the possibility of it that leaves us anxious in the midst of storms. Those who have lost jobs or close relationships or the use of their body because of an accident or who have gone through any such crisis or trauma may also feel uncertain. People who have lived through or witnessed war may have their sense of goodness, the goodness of life, ripped away. When we experience these kinds of life-altering events, life-altering realities, it would not be surprising for us to ask, "God, do you not care that our hope is perishing?" From the very beginning, the people of God have struggled to keep faith in the stormy times of crisis. Approximately 60 of our 150 psalms are lament psalms. A lament is very simply a prayer to God in the time of crisis. A common question that psalmists ask is, "How long, Lord?" For example, Psalm 13. It's a prayer for deliverance from enemies. And the psalmist asks in verses 1 and 2, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long must I bear pain in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all day long?" Obviously, people of faith have never been immune from the storms of life. Lutheran pastor Nadia Bolz-Weber explains, "Being God's people doesn't give us a special dispensation for an easier storm-filled life, storm-free life. Both New Age and prosperity gospel thinking would have us believe that if we just have enough faith, or just think positively enough, we will draw only good things to ourselves. But life doesn't work like that. Bad things happen to all people." So what is the role of faith in our lives then? What does it do for us if it does not exempt us from suffering? In verses 1 through 3 of the 46th Psalm, we get something of an answer. The psalmist assures us, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should change, though the mountains shake in the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble with its tumult. In the midst of the tumult, God is our very present help. If we can absorb these promises of God into our hearts and minds, we can cultivate a faith that sustains us and gives us courage to face the storms of life that we know will come. In the same way that a child knows that they are safe in the arms of their parents, we too can find that feeling of safety in the loving arms of God. And yet, we don't have the possibility of physically feeling wrapped in God's arms. We don't have that feeling to cling to in times of trouble. So how do we become aware of God's very present help to us in troubling times? A first step might be to pause and take a deep, spirit-filled breath. Our impulse in stormy times is to spring into action, and that makes sense. I'm sure that the disciples were busy bailing water out of the boat as fast as they could as Jesus slept through the wind and the rain. Until the storms that we face die down, it makes sense to simply try to survive. But then Jesus woke. He cried out, "Peace, be still." And though we hear this as a command to the waves and the wind, I think we might also understand it as a cry to the disciples. Peace, be still. Jesus was addressing his disciples who so badly needed a sign that he was there with them. Jesus was inviting the disciples to let the anxiety that was flooding their minds fade away so that they could hear his voice and see that they were secure in the care of God. In another verse from Psalm 46, we hear the psalmist exhort us to be still and know that I am God. Like the disciples, it is easier for us to become aware of God's loving care when we let our anxiety and our hurry fade, and we create space for ourselves to listen for the voice of God. According to Henri Nouwen, given our worried, overfilled lives, solitude and silence are essential to deepening our relationship to God. Nouwen writes, if we really believe not only that God exists, but also that God is actively present in our lives, healing, teaching, and guiding, we need to set aside a time and a space to give God our undivided attention, even in the midst of challenging times. For some of us, silence, solitude sounds lovely. We can imagine creating that. But for those of us who struggle with the idea of sitting in quiet and meditation, we might find spiritual practices such as going on a walk, listening to music, or reading the Bible and letting something jump out at us that soothes our hearts and minds to be the path we want to take to create space for God. Sometimes it's in serving others that we are given moments of peace and clarity about God's presence with us in the midst of difficulty. One of my friends from school remarked to me the other day after we had done a shift as volunteer nurses at the Eugene Mission. She said, life just seems to settle down and make more sense after spending time with the people here. The chaos of life just seems to fade away. As a community of faith, we also experience God's voice calling to us when we come to this place, surrounded by our friends who are facing the storms of life by our sides. Jesus meets us here. in water and the word, in bread and wine, in the greetings and love of our friends. These ways of opening ourselves up to God don't fully insulate us from the storms of life, but they do give us an anchor to keep us secure in the midst of the storm. They give us Jesus, God's Son, who calls us into his love and peace even as he commands the wind and the waves. The disciples asked, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" It is Jesus. Jesus is God's definitive answer to the disciples' question, "Do you not care?" Jesus is God's assurance that God is present in the midst of storms and that God deeply cares for us. When we experience the storms of life, we have God's promises to rely on as we wait for Jesus to wake and bring peace. And he will. Jesus always does. There will be calm. There will be peace. Amen. We'll continue with our hymn of the day, "Great is Thy Faithfulness."